Welcome to today's panel on the U.S. debt. My name is Marjorie Rose, and I'm going to be moderating today's panel. I'm a member of the economics faculty at Dartmouth College, but I am here today more in the role of faculty advisor to the student group What's Up, Wake Up, Speak Up, Dartmouth Students for Fiscal Responsibility. It's a nonpartisan group, and its main objective is to educate the public on the need for fiscal responsibility. What's Up is particularly grateful to the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy, who is supporting and helping educate Dartmouth students in this Dartmouth community on this important issue. And as a final plug for the group, any student that might be interested in this issue should blitz me after the talk. Today's talk has a rather sensational topic, in case you haven't noticed it. Debtor Nation, the threat to America's future. A recent ABC News Washington Post poll found that virtually all adults over 40 years old were concerned about the federal budget deficit. And 68% of these older adults were very concerned. By contrast, adults under 40 years old were decidedly less worried. In fact, only about a third of younger adults aged 18 to 29, about your ages, were at all concerned about the fiscal deficit. I think I might give you something to think about. Most of us have become much more aware of the role that debt played in the recent financial crisis. We know that if we look at trends over the past several decades, the amount of debt across all categories in the United States has increased markedly. For example, household debt has increased from about 60% of household income in 1980 to over 130% of household income in the last year. Public sector debt over the same period has risen from about 35% of GDP to almost 80% of GDP in this year. The real impetus for the panel today is the outlook for the U.S. federal debt, not just over the next few years, but what will happen to this level of debt in the coming decades. Given the realities of an aging population and rising healthcare costs, unless policies are changed significantly, future fiscal deficits at the federal level are projected to increase substantially. Remember that every year we have a fiscal deficit, our government spends more than it collects in tax revenues, and we have to borrow that amount. Our stock of debt increases in the form of outstanding U.S. Treasury bills and Treasury bonds. If current policies don't change, our stock of debt is projected to increase from the current level of about $11.3 trillion, or about 80% of today's GDP, to anywhere from 200 to 350% of GDP in the coming decades. Obviously, we can't maintain the current trajectory of policies, and this fiscal path is not sustainable. We're very fortunate to have three eminent scholars who have also considerable experience in the realm of public policy to enlighten us on the trends and prospects for the U.S. fiscal situation. James POTERBA is the MITSUI Professor of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Since last year, Jim has been president of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and actually you may have seen him on CNBC or CNN. He was the guy who announced the official start of the current recession. That's one of the NBR's responsibilities. Jim was a member of the President's Advisory Panel on Federal Tax Reform in 2005, and he has a wide range of research interests, including pension and portfolio decisions and tax policy. In addition to being a professor of economics at Dartmouth College, Andrew SAMWICK is currently the director of the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy. Andrew served as chief economist for the Council of Economic Advisors in the Bush administration and has written extensively in the areas of Social Security, pensions, savings, and taxation. John Skinner is the John Sloan Dickey Professor of Economics at Dartmouth College and is also a professor of medicine at the Dartmouth Institute for Health Policy and Clinical Practice. His research has bridged the fields of economics and medicine, including such topics as efficiency of Medicare and savings for retirement. And you may have seen his most recent article in this week's New Yorker. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Jim POTERBA.
It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon to talk about what is really the first order issue in fiscal policy for the United States, which is the long-term outlook for fiscal deficits and the way that policy may adapt over the coming decades to try to address what is now clearly a long-term sustainability issue that has arisen in the United States. And what I'll try to do in my remarks is to focus on laying out some of the perspective on U.S. deficits and debt policy to date, a bit of information on what the projections look like, and then I want to talk a bit about tax policy and how taxes might play a role in addressing some of the issues that we're talking about this afternoon. Then Andrew and John will in turn talk about Social Security and about Medicare and Medicaid, which are really important contributory factors as we look out to the long-term projections. I think if one wanted to take a very simple summary of concerns about fiscal policy in the U.S., for quite a long time, for at least a decade, there has been a sense that the U.S. had a long-term fiscal issue that was tied up with the retirement of the baby boom generation and linked up with entitlement programs involving Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, because those programs would become a larger and larger share of the U.S. economy as we went forward. And those programs would require increased revenue to finance them. And unless we managed to raise taxes or cut the programs, we would have a growing deficit as we looked out to the 1, 2, 3 decade horizon going forward. Okay. The last 2 years, which have been a truly remarkable period of economic upheaval, have shifted the focus on these fiscal policy issues from the several decade out horizon to today. And the reason is because as a consequence of the actions that the federal government has taken to address the financial crisis, we have seen unprecedented levels of peacetime government deficits in the US. The same thing's been happening in many other developed countries as well. The result is that projections about debt levels that would rise in the 2020s have now become projections that we see by the middle of the current decade or by 2020. And the discussions that had previously been something we can worry about down the road have really been accelerated to the current period, so that people have started to talk much more actively about long-term fiscal issues and how we manage to come out of the current period of unusual fiscal activism and put ourselves on a sustainable long-term path, okay, in a way that we have not seen in a serious discussion for quite a long time. So this panel is incredibly timely in the sense that the discussion of these deficit issues, I think, is really just beginning to get serious, because as one thinks about getting beyond the sort of remedial actions to help the economy through a very difficult patch, one then has to think about what is the long-term path that we want to be attaching ourselves to, and how is that going to look. So let me start by giving you some sense of the long-term fiscal projections that are made at the present time. Alan Auerbach, who's an economist at Berkeley, Bill Gale at the Brookings Institution, do calculations where they essentially look out over a 75-year horizon for the U.S. economy, taking current legislation that's on the books, projections about the growth rate of the elderly population, medical care costs, and other things that are made by the Social Security Administration, by other government agencies. What they conclude is that we have a structural deficit of between 4 and 6% of GDP. Okay, what does that mean? In order to balance over a 75-year horizon the expenditure programs that we have with the revenues that we're going to collect, we would need to either reduce spending or raise taxes or do some combination of the two by between 4 and 6% of GDP to get back to balance. Okay? If we don't do that, we continue to experience rising periods of debt as we go forward. Okay? Now, there are, in some sense, two key drivers of this: the Social Security deficits that we face going forward and the Medicare and Medicaid deficits. Our later speakers will talk about these, but I want to alert you at the outset that Social Security is very much the easier of these problems to address, because it's the result of an older population in the future and a smaller future workforce. Medicare and Medicaid are much harder because in addition to the fact that the older population is the beneficiary population for those programs, there's also an intrinsic growth in medical care costs that's running it faster than the rate of inflation in the economy at large. So the federal government has taken on this liability to deliver a set of goods, to deliver health insurance to the elderly population and to the indigent population, and it turns out that delivering that bundle of goods is getting more and more expensive over time. And John will talk a little bit about the projections in those areas. To give you a sense of the recent fiscal history, though, and the reason that some of these issues have suddenly come to the fore in the last year or so, I think it's helpful to just get some guidance on what the level of deficits are and what we're dealing with in terms of these numbers. So in fiscal 2007, the federal government, by the way, has a very strange fiscal year. It ends in September. In fiscal 2007, the federal deficit, and I'm going to focus, by the way, just on the federal government in my remarks, was about $160 billion. And that's about 1.2% of GDP. Okay. In fiscal 2008, it increased to about $460 billion, 3.2% of GDP. And that, of course, reflected some of the new stimulus activity, the tax rebates that were enacted during part of 2008. Fiscal 2009, which we're still in the midst of, has just been a year for the record books, with the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, currently projecting that the deficit for this year will be on the order of $1.7 trillion, which is close to 12% of GDP. And that doesn't reflect some of the additional spending programs that are at least on the table in some of the proposals the administration has made. So when the CBO looks at the president's budget, they come out with a conclusion that we may well see a 13% of GDP deficit this year. Now, there's a very basic mechanical interaction between the deficit and the debt ratio. Right? Debt, basically, the only way you fill the hole of the deficit is you borrow. So that you can basically think of this as the debt has to increase by something like a tranche of $1.7 trillion this year in order to basically cover the cost of the deficits that we are incurring. Okay? The debt in some way is the sum of the past year's deficits brought to the present day, leaving aside some of the things like the change in the value of government debt over time. Okay, now, what do the projections look like as we go forward? Under the CBO baseline, it looks as though we actually start to decline in terms of deficits beginning in fiscal 2010, come down to about 8% of GDP. By fiscal 2012, we're down to 2.1% of GDP. But that is under the assumption that all of the current legislation stays on the books and that nothing new is enacted. Okay? When CBO looks at what's in the president's budget, which calls, for example, for the extension of tax cuts that currently expire in 2010, it calls for additional expenditure programs in some areas, CBO concludes that we are coming back down toward an area of around 4% of GDP as a deficit and not down to the 2% that the current law projections would suggest. So what's that imply? The key issue is sort of where's the asymptote that we're coming back toward? Right? Are we coming back to the point where we're going to repay some of the deficits and debt increases that we've seen in the last few years, or are we coming down toward an asymptote where we continue to run prolonged deficits, and those deficits take us forward to the period when we run into the full retirement of the baby boom and get into some greater fiscal challenges there? To put this in historical perspective, this slide shows you, and the last year here is 2008. This slide just shows you the history of federal deficits between 1960 and 2008. And you can see that we had periods with as high a deficit as 6% of GDP in the early 1980s. And this was the time when President Reagan promised to both reduce taxes and cut expenditure programs. The Congress granted the tax decrease in 1981. David Stockman ran into more difficulties than expected at managing to cut the spending programs, and the result was a ballooning deficit. And after that, we basically worked through a period of tax increases in 1983 and 1984 to try to fill back in. And you can see that by the middle of the 1980s, we brought the deficits down to some degree. Okay? Well, this chart, as I said, also shows you the late 1990s when, during a period of rapid economic growth and relatively stable tax code, okay, with top marginal rates that were still up around 39.6 in the late 1990s, we actually managed to collect enough revenue to get into surplus for a while. And we were actually drawing down the debt to GDP ratio in the late 1990s. That changed in the early years of this decade with the large tax cut that was enacted in 2001. And just to give you some perspective on where we are today, okay, this chart just adds in 2009, 2010, and 2011. And what you see is that it kind of changes the perspective on all of the prior history. That the kind of deficits that we are seeing relative to GDP today have not been experienced in peacetime post-war history. You have to go back to World War II to see experiences that look like they are of this order of magnitude. Now, where do we fit in an international comparison? The deficit as a share of GDP in the US is near the upper end of our industrialized counterparts, but Japan and the UK are very much in similar terrain at the moment as they try to reflate their economies in a similar fashion. The stimulus package we've put in place is also at the larger end for the industrial nations. But if you move beyond the stimulus package and you say, let's look at debt to GDP, okay? This is a chart which is not going to show you the deficit, but it's now going to move to looking at the debt. US debt to GDP was about 100% in 1945 as we came out of World War II. That fell to about 55% by 1955. And by the way, about the same thing happened after World War I. We drew down the debt to GDP ratio by nearly 45% in the 10 years after the First World War, which leads me to think that we probably will do something to draw down the debt to GDP ratio this time, but the question is exactly what. Okay? But what you can see is that we have, after getting out of the immediate post-war period, the debt to GDP ratio stayed somewhere between about 40% and 25% through most of the following half century. Okay? But again, if you start to look at where we are with the current projections, you see that we are now on a trajectory of rising debt to GDP ratios. By 2020, the Congressional Budget Office currently forecasts that we'll be up to about an 80% debt to GDP ratio for the US. How does that compare with the rest of the world? Well, it depends on whether you look at the rest of the world before or after the current round of fiscal activism. In 2007, you can see that only Italy and Japan within the G7 economies had debt to GDP ratios that were more than 50%, and that projections at this point would be for many of these countries to experience larger debt to GDP ratios than that 50% threshold going forward. So the US on the Congressional Budget Office's forecast by 2020 would have a debt to GDP ratio that was in the range of where, say, Italy was in the middle of the current decade. And I think one of the challenges is figuring out, what does it mean for a country to run up the debt to GDP ratio in that way? And to be perfectly honest, there isn't a very simple and straightforward answer to offer you. Because as the debt to GDP ratio goes up, the principal concern, of course, is can the country repay the debt? What's going to happen going forward? And if you're a lender thinking about lending money to this government, you worry, just as if you're lending to a private corporation, about the ultimate repayment that you're going to get on the loan. There is actually a marketplace, the credit default swap marketplace, is a place where you can look for essentially bets in the financial market on the likelihood that debts will be repaid of various kind. And this is a thin market, so you don't want to put too much stock in these numbers. But as of late April, if you looked at the credit default swap market for Italy for 10-year bonds, you would have to pay essentially 100 basis points, which is like 1% of the value of the bond, to get an insurance product that would pay off in the event that Italy defaulted on its debt. So it's like the market was pricing in a 1% default rate. For Ireland, which is in a much deeper downturn, the default pricing was something like 2.5% at the same time. For the UK, that number was about 1% as well. At the same time, for McDonald's and for Campbell's Soup, the numbers were down in the 0.2, 0.3 percentage points. Now, I haven't put the US on here. The US actually was at some point trading at about 30 basis points, which is on the order of McDonald's. But the traders who I've talked with tell me that it's very hard to figure out who would be left standing if the US Treasury is in default. And consequently, the issues about counterparty risk, which have come to the fore in discussing the recent financial crisis, are pretty tricky in thinking through how to make sense of these kind of CDS prices. Nonetheless, what is very clear here is that sovereign borrowers can face higher rates of return that the market will demand because their debt is viewed as risky, and there are different sovereign riskinesses across different borrowers, even amongst countries that are within the G20 or the G7. Okay, so that is the concern, of course, going forward, is that if the US debt looks risky, interest rates will start to rise. There is, in the very short period, however, been an enormous countervailing effect, which is that the US is viewed as the safe haven, right, the port in the storm. So interest rates on Treasury debt have at various points in the last year been very low, despite the fact that the projections were showing that we were going to be running a larger and larger stock of debt. And it was a matter of, as the standard economist's question of comparing something, well, what are you going to compare it to? Treasury debt for the U.S. looked relatively safe by comparison to most of the other things you could imagine holding assets in. And that, as that begins to sort of unwind, as the world begins to decide other things are safer again, some of that flight to quality effect may start to disappear. In terms of the empirical economics research that looks at the question of how deficits and debt stocks affect interest rates, basically suggests that very short-run fluctuations in deficits, something like a year or 2 years of big deficits, typically don't translate into large changes in interest rates. Why? Because relative to the stock of debt the country has outstanding, relative to the stock of debt in the world that all of the sovereign borrowers have, it doesn't have that big an impact. On the other hand, when you get yourself onto an unsustainable path, and it looks as though you have a long-term challenge of managing to balance the budget, that actually has a potentially larger impact on long-term interest rates. And of course, the question is always, you're always suspicious when you're talking about financial markets and someone says it's different this time. The question this time is, will we see the kind of drawdown in the debt to GDP ratio that we saw after World War I and after World War II taking place in the course of the next 10 to 15 years? And that's where we're going to get into the question, of course, of what policies are there. One thing that Marjorie in her introduction said there's much more concern about this. I think that's exactly right. I think after a long time when the political climate was tilted toward don't worry about deficits, don't think about this very much, the public doesn't care about deficits, my sense is that is actually beginning to shift. Just in the last week, one finds, for example, the week and a half, the story about the UK being put on credit watch by one of the rating agencies, suddenly creating a great concern about whether borrowing rates for UK bonds were going to rise. John Taylor, former member of the Treasury Department staff under Bush, with an exploding debt threatens America op-ed in the Financial Times last week. And then even USA Today was in it this weekend with leap in debt, US debt saddles taxpayers, doing some simple calculations of how much the increase in debt per family was as a result of the run-up in the deficits that we've seen in the last year. So I think this may be the beginning of a groundswell of greater interest in thinking about these issues. And if we start to think about them, the question is, what do you do to attack them? How do you try to get the long-term sustainability back into line for a country like the U.S.? Well, for Social Security and for Medicare, you have to get into the nuts and bolts of the programs, or you have to raise more money with the taxes that finance those programs. And I'm not going to say much about the items here. For Social Security, you begin to think about raising the retirement age, changing around the indexing rules so that the benefits are not fully indexed for both inflation and potential wage growth. You think about means testing those programs as another way of trying to rein in their cost. You can also think about, and those are all things which affect the retiree population, you can also think about changing it on the working population by altering the payroll tax, expanding the top amount of income that could be taxed, or expanding the tax rate on the payroll tax. For Medicare, it's actually much harder. Okay, Social Security is something where it's almost an accounting problem. I like to say if you locked a bunch of economists from all sides of the political spectrum in a room and credibly told them that you'd starve them if they didn't come up with a plan to save Social Security and make it solvent in a day, they'd come out with a plan. Because you can do some of all of these things and basically get to solvency. Medicare is much harder. You might actually have to starve the economist in that case, because with Medicare, you have to deal with this fact that the spending rate is growing faster than the economy as a whole, and you have to figure out how do you rein in that growth of spending. And simple means testing or simple raising taxes doesn't deal with that, because you've got two trends, one growing faster than the other, and that even if you put off the day of reckoning, you still are going to face the day of reckoning down the line. So I'm looking forward to seeing how John's going to tell us about what we do on those challenges. I want to say just a little bit before I close about the tax side, because there, as soon as if you say we're not going to try to tackle the expenditures, and that can be the spending on the entitlement programs, or it can be the spending on other non-entitlement programs in the U.S. economy, you have to then decide we're going to pay for them somehow. And the only way to do that is to raise taxes. And the only way to raise taxes is either to raise the rates on which we tax the things that we currently tax, expand the base of what we tax, or introduce a new tax. Okay? And there doesn't seem to be tremendous political appetite for any of those three things. But let me just say a little bit about how you think about the comparisons there. First, what happens if you raise rates? One of the touchstone lessons of public finance economics, the study of tax policy, is that taxes create distortions, right? Anytime the government says that if I go to work, I can earn, $10 an hour, but I'm going to only get to keep $7 of that amount. I am going to decide how much to work based on the $7 price that I face, but the market economy is telling me that what I do is worth $10, and consequently there's a difference between the price I face and the price the market would like to pay for what I do. That creates a distortion. I may choose the wrong level of labor supply in an environment like that. Okay? As tax rates get higher, it turns out that the size of the distortion gets larger. And it doesn't just rise with the tax rate itself. It rises with something closer to the square of the tax rate, right? Those of you who are coming back to hear this lecture probably weren't expecting an algebra lesson today. But it's the tax rate times the tax rate that determines how large this distortion is, because the tax rate itself determines how large the difference between the market, what the market pays and what you keep is, and then the size of the labor supply change also depends on how large that tax rate is. So the two of them actually multiply each other. What that means is that going from a tax rate of, let's say, 20% to 25% is less punishing than going from a tax rate of 30 to 35%, and that doubling your tax rate increases the burden of that tax by a factor of 4, not by a factor of 2. Okay? So there's a tendency amongst the economics profession to try to find a way to get efficient taxes, which mean that the rates you use are lower relative to the base, and trying to focus on a larger base. Okay? Now, how do you get the base to be larger? Well, that means you have to tax either more things under the income tax, or you have to decide to go outside the income tax and levy new taxes. With respect to the income tax, the only way you can broaden the base is to rein in some of the deductions that we currently have. And this is one of the things that the tax panel I served on in 2005 tried to do. We recommended tightening up the mortgage interest deduction, tightening up the taxation of employer-provided health insurance, limiting the deduction for state and local taxes, limiting the charitable contribution deduction. None of those things were very popular when we offered them as suggestions. All of them were attacked immediately by legislators from states that would be particularly affected, and none of them seemed to create a groundswell of popular support in defense of deficit reduction for limiting any of those popular deductions. And that is fundamentally the challenge with dealing with this, right? You have to find a way to get the political compromise to try to attack these problems. Lots of people are worried about deficits. Very few people are enthusiastic about higher taxes, and they in some sense are one and the same side of what's there. The income tax today has become a very concentrated tax in the U.S., and a very high fraction of income tax revenues are now paid by folks at the very top of the income distribution. If you look, for example, in 2006, the top 1% of the income distribution, which, for those of you who want to check on how you're doing, that started at about $390,000 in AGI in 2006. That group received about 22% of adjusted gross income in the U.S. economy. They paid about 40% of the income taxes. Top 5% had about 37% of the income and about 60% of the tax liability. So if one works through the income tax, one's going to actually put the burden on a relatively narrow part of the population. Now, this is beyond the realm of economics. This is now politics, and you have to decide who's going to bear the burdens, and economists don't have much to offer in terms of recommendations there. But this may be an issue in terms of a constraint on what tax policy can do as we go forward. Okay. The other potential revenue sources, what else is out there? Well, there is the value-added tax. And the value-added tax, which is used in every other major industrialized country, is basically a national sales tax. The VAT, one of the standard Washington jokes is that the reason we don't have a VAT is because the Democrats think it's regressive and the Republicans think it's a money machine. And as soon as they switch sides, we'll get one very quickly. Now, whether that's exactly the explanation, I'm not quite sure. But a value-added tax in the U.S. would raise about $50 billion per percentage point of tax, which means that you'd collect about $500 billion with a 10% VAT in the U.S. That makes a noticeable impact on the kind of deficit numbers that we are talking about today. Nonetheless, there doesn't seem to be great support for thinking about that. Environmental taxes, that's another possibility, right? As recently as a few months ago, there was discussion that maybe we would collect a lot of revenue with taxes on CO2 or other fossil fuels. The way it appears as though policy is going at the moment is that we are going to try to enact legislation to reduce fossil fuel emissions and things like that. On the other hand, we're not going to collect a lot of revenue either by auctioning the permits or by taxing those things. So that looks again as though we don't have a lot of revenue coming from there. Where does that leave us all? Colbert, who was the finance minister to Louis XIV, said that the art of taxation is the plucking of the goose with the minimum of squawking. My fear is that the political process at the moment is not very geared up for goose plucking, because there really hasn't been the recognition that the numbers we've talked about at the beginning, which are these long-term sustainability issues, either require spending cuts or tax increases. None of the tax increases are going to be popular, but to get to the point where we will have this kind of discussion in a more serious way, I think discussions like the one today, which call attention to these long-term deficit issues, are really, really very important. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Marjorie, for putting this panel together. So my task on this panel is to talk to you about one of the large entitlement programs that presents a threat to America's future in the context of its finances. Lots of times when I speak about Social Security, I start by saying it takes an economist to turn something like higher longevity, greater opportunities for women, into something that's a threat to America's future. The challenges here are strictly in the context of financing. Social Security is a program whose mechanics have been hammered out over the past 7 decades and currently presents something that most people are generally happy with. Let me begin by saying what I think Social Security is and why it belongs in a panel on debtor nation. The first thing to say about Social Security is the benefits that it provides. It is an entitlement program that provides insurance against old age, survivorship, or disability. Survivorship just meaning that a spouse predeceases you. Old age is a very subjective term. I'm not going to comment on that. Or disability is the part that is in this program that people may not be so aware of. How does it pay the benefits? It's an annuity, meaning it pays you until death. It is indexed in its calculation to the growth of wages, proxying the growth in the standard of living after retirement to the growth of prices to preserve its purchasing power. And it's mandatory, meaning there are very few places where you can get out of paying Social Security taxes. And it's progressive. Progressive meaning that the benefits are a larger fraction of pre-retirement earnings for people who had lower earnings. And so in that sense, you could think of it as alleviating poverty. How do we pay for this? It is a uniform rate payroll tax on all earnings up to some maximum taxable earnings amount. There is a portion of the benefits that are subjected to the income tax. And so that pays currently roughly about 1/10 of the total revenues that come into this. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out at the outset that before the last major expansion in the benefit formula for Social Security, and this is over 30 years ago, the poverty rate among elderly households was the highest among any age group. And it was thanks to the expansion in Social Security that is no longer the case. So elderly poverty is no more particularly of concern, say, than it is poverty in any other age group. That's a relative statement. So, debtor nation. How do you get debts associated with Social Security? Well, Social Security is a defined benefit pension plan. And whenever there's a defined benefit pension plan, the plan sponsor contrives a formula by which benefits will be paid, and then it is responsible for setting aside the funds that will make good on those promised benefits. And so whether these defined benefit plans are offered through private corporations, state and local governments, or even the federal government, there is a great temptation to promise benefits that are more generous than you are willing to raise the taxes to pay for. So if the government has specified a benefit formula, and all of us are going to work, earning income, earning an entitlement to future benefits, and the benefit formula is sufficiently generous, it's entirely possible that the promised benefits are more than the projected revenues coming in from the payroll tax and the income tax on benefits. And so that is analogous to federal debt. How analogous? Well, in 2009, which is the last trustees report that we have available, the present value of projected, don't ever say forecasted, the actuaries will kill you. The projected unfunded obligations could be characterized in three ways. First, $15.1 trillion, so that's more than 100% of GDP. So if you wanted to stack that onto all of the bars in the histogram in the charts that Jim was showing, you would have another 120% or thereabout percent of GDP at this point in time. Now, the U.S. government cannot pass legislation saying that it will not pay off on the bonds that are held privately. That's a default. The federal government can decide that it will change the rules for Social Security to close this gap without it causing nearly the uproar that a formal default would be on a bond. But if you're intending to pay the benefits and you're intending to only collect the specified amount of tax revenue, you should think of this implicit debt on a par with the explicit debt that the government has issued in the form of treasury bonds. If you wanted to get some idea of what it would take to close that gap into the indefinite future, it would be a number like 3.4% of taxable payroll. So by that I mean the current Social Security payroll tax is 12.4 percentage points, split between the employer and the employee. Medicare adds another 2.9 percentage points. So if you took that 12.4 percentage points, you would have to boost that by 3.4 percentage points and keep that into the indefinite future. That's one indication of the magnitude of this projected gap. Or because taxable payroll is not the usual denominator in these calculations, it's equivalent to 1.2 percentage points of gross domestic product. So from now into the indefinite future, this gap in Social Security's financing is 1.2% of the gross domestic product. Okay, so to me that's pretty big. I confess that was big to me 20 years ago when I started working on issues related to Social Security, but I think I've got a pretty itchy trigger finger on matters of so-called fiscal responsibility. Okay, so how do we get here? What drives these costs in Social Security? I'll say that it's three things. The first is the generosity of the program. If you didn't mind having a lot of poor elderly folks, you could make this program a lot less generous. With fewer benefits being paid out, then there would be less of a financing gap. Okay? Or if you didn't mind higher taxes, you could just raise them to the tune of 3+ percentage points, and you could take care of this projected gap. So obviously, replacement rates and tax rates are fundamental here. The second thing that's relevant is the economic factors that go into this, and mostly that's just the rate of growth of the wage base. You're levying taxes on wages to pay benefits that are indexed, pegged to past earnings. You could imagine that if all of a sudden the wage base doubled and the amount of benefits that you were paying did not double, then you could cut the tax rate in half to finance the same benefit stream. So the more rapid is the growth rate of wages, the easier it is to finance a pay-as-you-go system like this. And then the third set of characteristics are demographic in nature. You're taxing people during their working years, you're paying money to folks in, let's say, their golden years. The more people you have collecting benefits relative to the number of people paying in, the more difficult it is to sustain a redistributive program like this. Some of this is under the control of policy, but I want to emphasize, so I wrote it twice on the slide, that the key determinants of this are longevity, how long you live, principally how long you live after collecting benefits, and fertility rates, how many of the next generation is the current generation making. And I want to stress the demographics here because I want you to see that there's very little that can be done to avoid having to pay these costs. And so let me start in on that. This slide is life expectancy at age 65. This, like all the numbers I'm going to show you, is drawn from the most recent Social Security Trustees Report. The red line on the top is for our moderator. The blue line on the bottom is for our panelists. These are separated by gender. What you can see is that as going as far back as 1940, the average amount of years that were lived after age 65 was a number like 12 years. At present, that's a number like 17 years, and that is projected to go on increasing at roughly the average rate that it has been increasing over the next several decades. That's why these just sort of turn into straight lines here. What you'll find in these actuarial reports that Social Security does is that mostly the assumptions are on autopilot after the next 2 decades. Okay, so life expectancy at age 65 is projected to continue to rise. That means that for all the other parameters of this system held fixed, over time, the size of that elderly cohort is going to be growing. So you all know what this is. This is the baby boom when they started. So this is the fertility rate. This is the number of children each woman would have, or would be projected to have, if she faced the birth rates in the population by age at a particular time. And so at the height of the baby boom, which was, if I'm not mistaken, Jim, it was about 3.6 children per woman. And then we all know what happened after that. Oral contraception became more widely available. About a decade later, abortion on demand became law of the land. And I don't think we're ever going to go back to birth rates that are as high as what's presented here, right? It would be very unusual. It would certainly be higher than any developed country is currently experiencing. And in fact, if you look around the developing world, you don't actually see a lot of semi-industrialized countries with very high birth rates anymore. Basically, the shift from the agrarian to the industrialized society does away with extremely large average family sizes. Okay, so this is projected to be at about the replacement level at about 2 children per woman, extended out into the indefinite future. I can think of no reason to believe that this would become more optimistic for Social Security's financing. Okay, so that's fertility. This is a graph that is new to my presentations. I want to now start making the link between those demographics and the way we finance our entitlement programs. So the blue line on the bottom of this graph is just the ratio of the number of people over age 65 to the number of people between age 20 and 64. That is the ratio of the base populations. You would be drawing the population of beneficiaries out of the numerator. You would be drawing the population of workers out of the denominator. And that's been increasing and is projected to increase even more rapidly from the present time. The red line is now taking into account program participation. Participation is almost universal now. And so the numerators are quite similar. Almost everybody who's 65 and over is a beneficiary of Social Security. But why is this graph elevated? Why is this much higher? It's because not everybody between 20 and 64 is in the working population. So what is this graph showing us? It's showing us that when the program started, the number of beneficiaries per worker was about 12%, meaning if you had a population of 100 workers, you would have only 12 retirees to support them. If you look now, the number is in the low 30s, meaning that for every 100 workers, there are about 30 beneficiaries to support. And what you can see is that that's going to start increasing rapidly. That's the baby boom cohort going from being the oldest workers to the youngest beneficiaries. And by the time they're done, we're going to be approaching 50 beneficiaries per 100 workers. If you flip those over, that would be we've got 3 workers supporting each beneficiary now, and we'll have roughly 2 by the time the baby boomers have fully transitioned into retirement. The top graph is the one that I think is interesting. It combines the story about fertility and the story about longevity together. This is the total dependency ratio. So it's the ratio of the population under 20 or over 65 to the size of the population between those two ages, 20 to 64. And so if you thought like taking care of kids was in a sense taking the same thing as supporting senior citizens, you would realize that during the height of the baby boom, we had a lot more dependents than we do even now, or than we will for a very, very long time. There was something about the parents of the baby boom generation where they didn't sort of mind taking care of folks. And if you look at this graph, you see that little valley? That valley is 2011. It means that the combination of taking care of kids and taking care of senior citizens will be at its lowest that we will experience. It's sort of like Halley's Comet or something. It only happens every now and then. So if you think this burden, quote, is a challenge, it's only going to get more severe, right? We are at the local minimum. So now I'm going to take this red line, which is showing the demographic drivers of cost, and I'm going to keep that the same, but I'm going to map it against the so-called cost rate of the program. The cost rate of the program is the total amount that's paid out in benefits scaled by the amount of payroll that's subject to the payroll tax. So the blue line, which is measured off the left scale, is if I wanted to impose a single tax on payroll that would fully balance the program, how high would that tax have to be? And you can see that that's a number like 11.5% now, but as soon as the baby boomers start transitioning from being workers to being retirees, that number is going to go up dramatically. It's going to go up to about 17 percentage points. So it's tempting to blame the baby boom generation for this. And in fact, you shouldn't blame the baby boom generation. Because if you look at the end of this chart, we're in the year 2085 based on these projections. Now, the youngest baby boomer, God bless, it'll be a her, will be 120 years old, okay? And yet, we still have a 17% cost rate, which means that what the baby boomers did, what they will do is accelerate from now and into the next couple of decades what is a long-term shift made possible by lower fertility rates and higher longevity. And in fact, what the baby boomers have done is to make the entitlement programs look, we could say, artificially cheap, because they're a very large cohort of workers that are in there, working hard, paying their taxes, supporting the system. So the fact that the graph is not growing very rapidly at its extreme leftward part, despite the higher longevity and the lower fertility, is because the baby boomers are in there paying taxes. Okay, so was that nice? I got 3 more baby boomers here. We're okay? Good. See, I'm not part of the baby boom generation, so I have to tread lightly. So now I'm keeping the blue line the same, that's the cost rate, and I'm graphing it against the income rate. Right now, the green line is above the blue line, which means we're in a surplus. But eventually, meaning within the next decade, the blue line goes above the green line, and that's perpetual deficits in Social Security. Okay, and those get to numbers like 4 percentage points of the taxable payroll base. So, you know, it was 3.4% increase in tax if you started now, but there doesn't seem to be any intention to start now. The more you wait, the more it starts to look like 4 percentage points or even more, which is why I'd like to start early. This is a graph to preempt some of John's discussion. This comes from the Office of Management and Budget's recent budget perspectives. There is a thread going around discussion that it's not aging, it's health costs. For the next couple of decades, it's both. The shape that you see on the lighter colored graph is what I've just showed you. That's the cost rate. Aging is all of Social Security's financial challenge, and it is some of Medicare's financial challenge. Some meaning like 10%, according to the Office of Management and Budget. Everything on top of that, to get to the outer envelope of this, is that excess growth of medical costs per person adjusted for age and other factors. That's the excess growth of health insurance. So I would not want to suggest that the real problem is health. They are both problems. Eventually, the health problem will overwhelm the aging problem because the aging problem stops accelerating and kind of levels off. And so I would want our attention focused on both. 2 last things. Question, don't we have a trust fund for Social Security? Well, the good news is yes, and there's $2.4 trillion worth of special issue treasuries in there. The bad news is I've already deducted that from the gross liabilities to get you the 15.1. And the even worse news is that, yes, it is true, there is a trust fund. As long as there are bonds in the trust fund, Social Security will be able to pay benefits uninterrupted. There will not need to be an act of Congress to get those benefits paid. Beyond being a unit of account and a measure of the current value of the extent to which Social Security revenues have been used to pay for everything but Social Security, that's what that balance represents. But in the context of our larger budget policy, it doesn't mean anything to say the first couple of rows of students here. It's not as if we have reduced our indebtedness elsewhere by that amount. We have, in every significant budget pronouncement over the last several decades, treated the Social Security money as available for sale. So I think we now have students who post-date the Graham-Rudman-Hollings legislation, but this is when we were going to get serious in the 1980s about the deficit. The budget that triggered the sequestration, what a great word, we don't use that anymore, you know, the across-the-board cuts, was the deficit inclusive of the Social Security surplus. More recently, when President Bush decided that it was appropriate to say, let's cut the deficit in half in 5 years, he was speaking about the deficit inclusive of the large and growing Social Security surplus. It's getting less and less consequential, but when President Obama said, we're going to cut the deficit in half in 5 years, he was also speaking about the deficit inclusive of Social Security. And so in a sense, we don't take the Social Security surplus and seek to buy back more debt from the public than we otherwise would. And so I and my cohorts among the students should not feel like we have less of a debt burden elsewhere in order to help us meet these entitlements of the generations that come before us. And so the key policy questions, and I'll leave it at this, is what should be the standard for reform? I think the standard for reform has to be we're going to fully close that gap between projected revenues and projected costs. Anything else is a modification to the system, but will still leave us with the need to have panels like this a decade hence. What should be the timetable for reform? There is this magical construct in the discussion of federal budget policy that those who are, quote, at or near retirement, unquote, should not suffer as a result of any reform we might presently make. That was a statement that comes straight out of the 2001 Social Security Commission. Obviously, if we get to the point where it's a payments crisis, everybody's skin is in the game. But if you were to try to do something in advance of there actually being a payments crisis, at or near retirement is going to carry the day. Otherwise, the issue is likely to get demagogued. Okay, so what does that mean? The sooner you do this, the fewer are the people who are at or near retirement, because we all march 1 year at a time toward whatever that threshold is. How should any near-term surpluses be allocated? Okay, so we're going to get all excited to do something about Social Security, and we're going to gradually phase it in. Well, what does that mean? That means that taxes in the near term are going to go up and or benefits are going to go down, generating a larger Social Security surplus. Are we just going to treat that money as if it's available to fund other purchases that the government might make? I would argue that if we do that, all we're really doing is taking the payroll tax and using it to substitute for the income tax. And there are commentators who believe that that's what happened in the 1983 reforms, and so I doubt we're going to get to a point where we do that. I would still hope we would look to make some of those changes, but find a place, whether it's personal accounts or some other accounting convention, that walls that off from the rest of the government. Otherwise, we are not doing the younger members of our audience much of a favor by enacting these reforms. And then the last set of questions is, how hard do we lean on each of the program features that, as I've described, can be relevant for bringing Social Security back into balance? You got higher payroll taxes. You got a higher maximum taxable earnings. You could do either of those. You could have higher ages of benefit eligibility. You could have lower replacement rates. Or you could have less certainty in the payment of benefits. This is what most plans that would substitute some investment-based account for the traditional Social Security benefit would do. You would get the average replacement. You would get the, if you're basing the benefits on the expected return on stocks, you would have to acknowledge that those come associated with risk. And so that's the policy decisions that are going to have to come up. And the question is, even if these problems are manageable, which I fervently believe that they are, do we have the political capital available to actually manage them? And so I'll look forward to your questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I got the easiest problem for the last here, which is Medicare. And I think that the numbers are duly scary. In fact, I'm on this advisory board to Congressional Budget Office, and one of the questions was, well, they said, well, for the 75-year projections, we find healthcare spending exceeds GDP. What should we do about that? And well, technically, that could happen, but so those are the kinds of numbers that we're looking at. I think this graph from CBO shows somewhat different perspective. This is spending as a percentage of GDP, so this isn't the deficit. This is just total spending. And as Andrew has pointed out, there you see Social Security rising over time, but pretty much stabilizing. And actually, I feel better about Social Security. Andrew was very modest, but he is actually, he was in the Bush administration. He reached across the aisle and worked with Jeff Liebman, who was a Democrat, and he and they and a third person came up with, I think, what was the most sensible solution to the Social Security problem. So that's when I started sleeping more easily about Social Security. But Medicare and Medicaid is a really tough one, and if you like really hard problems, this is the problem for you. Now, what do you do about this? It's certainly, I guess this is the best way to sort of think about it. Doug Holtz-Eakin, who said for some of you who are old enough to remember, Social Security is Grenada, Medicare is Vietnam. And as you may recall, with Colonel SAMWICK here, we can take back Grenada, but I'm not so sure about Vietnam. So one of the very simple points is, and this was a column by David Leonhardt, is that social is how to pay for this continuing increase in Medicare, and in fact, not just Medicare, but also plans by the federal government to expand coverage to the uninsured, and so the senators are sort of talking about this, but they don't really want to talk about it very much, although they can all see it coming. So Kent Conrad stood up and produced a little bolt of honesty. Revenue is the thing almost nobody wants to talk about, said Mr. Conrad, but I think if we're going to be honest with each other, we've got to recognize that that is part of the solution as well. So again, getting back to Jim's talk, the message was, your taxes are going up. And if we don't do something very quickly about the Medicare, the growth in Medicare spending. Now, Congressional Budget Office published a fairly thick volume of different options for trying to rein in costs. And there are a variety of proposed approaches to cutting costs. And if you talk to physicians, they'll tell you, oh, the biggest problem we have is these malpractice suits. So limits on malpractice awards, that's $4 billion over 10 years. And actually, the physicians may save some as well, which would mean that you could cut, in theory, what you pay to physicians, although they might not like that. You could improve information technology. That's a great thing. It'll save lives. It'll improve the quality of healthcare. But at least the Congressional Budget Office says, it's not going to save much money, $5 billion. Bundle payments for post-acute care, another favorite proposal that you hear a lot about in Washington, $19 billion. Expand hospital quality programs, $2 billion. well, here's one thing that will save money, reduce hospital reimbursement updates by 1%. That's $92 billion, but that's cumulative. It only kind of phases in over time. But to keep these in perspective, I mean, obviously $1 billion is a lot of money, but the kinds of deficits of sort of combined increase in spending that exceeds Medicare trust funds and Medicare taxes is on the order of $600 to $1 trillion. So this is basically nothing. I mean, it's just like there's no money at all. I think there's a lot of frustration. It's like, where do we get the money to try to sort of rein in the healthcare costs? And Congressional Budget Office isn't helping much. Now, recently there was an announcement by the several providers, insurance companies, saying we can cut costs by 1.5% annually in total healthcare costs. Well, if we started about $2.2 trillion in, say, 2009, maybe a little bit higher than that, you can see real benefits over the longer term by cutting costs by 1.5%. But two things to observe. First of all, 1.5% compared to what? And how does everybody propose to do that? I think it's fairly hard to sort of figure out how this whole thing would work, how the government could actually certify cuts, and now actually some of the people involved are beginning to backpedal on the whole thing. But more importantly is that when you offer to cut cost growth, and it's very useful, and it's really the only way to solve the problem, but in terms of where do you get the money, 40% of the total revenue savings of about $2 trillion here comes in the last 2 years. So you can see that if you start cutting cost growth, you don't get very much at the beginning. It only starts kind of piling in at the end, which makes it difficult if you want to expand healthcare coverage today to people who don't have health insurance. But I will surely pay you on Tuesday, or I should say, I will surely pay for this 9 or 10 years ago from now when we actually start to collect revenue. So that will actually add to even more pressure, these kinds of proposals, even more pressure on the deficit, at least in the short term. But that said, now that I've sort of explained why I'm a little nervous about growth rates, growth rates do matter a great deal. And this is from a study that we published with Elliot Fisher and Julie Bynum in the New England Journal in February, and it shows growth rates in healthcare spending across regions. Now, for any of you who have heard of the Dartmouth Institute for Health Policy and Clinical Practice, or of Jack Wenberg, who really started the whole thing and started asking the right questions, which we've been trying to spend the last few decades trying to answer, that the idea is that different regions actually behave quite differently, not just in levels, but also in growth rates. So you can see, for example, that San Francisco and East Long Island in 1992 were about the same. And during this time period, actually, East Long Island grew quite a bit more rapidly. Not hugely, that's the gray line compared to the yellow line. And so by 2006, they were a couple $1,000s per person higher than in San Francisco. And you think, yeah, a couple $1,000s, maybe they're sort of doing more tests. But if you add that up, that's $1 billion just for East Long Island. Just for East Long Island. And so once you start adding up these differences, you start getting real money. For example, again, let's look at San Francisco. I don't think anybody in San Francisco is complaining about the health care they get. They get among the best in the country. Yet if the United States had grown at the same rate as San Francisco and continues to grow at the lower San Francisco rates out for the next 20 years, we would reverse a $600 billion deficit in the Medicare program to a $600 billion surplus. That is, very small differences in growth rates can have very large effects on the fiscal deficit, given, again, the earlier concerns that I expressed before. Now, my favorite place is Miami. You'll notice Miami started out high, and it remains high. So the change in spending in Miami, these are all adjusted for inflation, between 1992 and 2006 is about $8,000. The increase in spending in Miami, which is the level, about equal to the level of spending in San Francisco in 2006. Now, as it turns out, people in Miami don't seem to be getting all that much healthier. If anything, they're lagging a little bit behind, but it certainly is a lot of money going to a fairly small group of people in the United States. Now, I want to turn to another example. Once you start looking at maps, it's hard to turn away. And this is a tale of two cities. This is El Paso and McAllen. This is the lower part of Texas, you can see. And McAllen is down there, and El Paso is up here. Neither a region is very wealthy. They both have fairly high unemployment rates, fairly high uninsurance rates. They have roughly equal levels of poor health. El Paso was, I think that was sort of close to where No Country for Old Men was, at least took place. So this is not sort of like, the health club center of the world. And something very interesting started happening there, which certainly got our attention. You can see in 1992 they were virtually identical. And something happened in McAllen. And it was hard to figure out what it was. So that's per capita age, sex, race adjusted spending in McAllen. On the green line, there's El Paso, the red line. It sort of continued to grow, not all that fast. By 2006, McAllen is spending twice as much as El Paso. Are people doing better in McAllen? Are they living longer? The answer is no. And we really couldn't figure this out, but fortunately, we found somebody who could, I didn't actually write the article, but I wish I had, Atul Gawande, who is by far the most talented writer I've ever run into, and he's a surgeon at Harvard. And he hopped on the plane, and he flew down to McAllen, Texas, to sort of see what was going on there. And it's spring, it's warm, it's a wonderful story. This is in this week's New Yorker, actually, sort of last week's New Yorker. And he started asking people what was going on. And let me read briefly from the article, although I strongly recommend it. About 15 years ago, so I'm quoting here, about 15 years ago, it seemed, which is really good timing. Look back there. About 15 years ago, it seems something began to change in McAllen. A few leaders of local institutions took profit growth to be a legitimate ethic in the practice of medicine. Not all the doctors accepted this, but they failed to discourage those who did. So here, along the banks of the Rio Grande, in the square dance capital of the world, a medical community came to treat patients the way subprime mortgage lenders treated homebuyers, as profit centers. So next paragraph. The real puzzle of American healthcare, I realized on the airplane home, is not why McAllen is different from El Paso. It's why El Paso isn't like McAllen. Every incentive in the system is an invitation to go the way McAllen has gone. And so I think this is sort of the lesson that you take home is sometimes, now granted, McAllen is an outlier. Most places aren't like McAllen. There are very low-cost regions as well, and actually the Hanover-Lebanon region is a pretty low-cost area, although it's been growing in its own way. But I think the message here is that in order to get the deficits under control, in order to get that long-term growth rate under control, that the incentives have to change in the way that the system is organized. There's some. This is there are also some remarkable differences just in levels as well. So this is a graph that Jack Wenberg has put together for the 2008 Chronic Care Atlas. And what he did was he took the people in the last 2 years of life, so the people and with identifiable chronic illness, as a way to try to compare sick people in different areas. So in other words, these are all pretty sick people in the sense that they're all dead within 2 years. And then he counted up how much money was spent on them. And And my favorite example is actually the Cleveland Clinic. Cleveland Clinic is a top quality, these are all top quality medical centers, and the red ones, the ones that are listed on the right, are U.S. News and World Report list of the best medical centers probably in the world. But even within those centers, there's tremendous difference in how they treat chronically ill patients. Cleveland Clinic, it's hard to argue that people in Cleveland are, again, much healthier than people, say, who go to the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, but they sure do cost less. And again, it's a different style. It's a different style of treatment. You don't do everything that you possibly can for your patients. I don't think Cedars-Sinai is populated by people who have an incredibly strong profit motive the way that we see in McAllen, but there is still really very little limits in terms of the things that they do for their patients, in terms of lots and lots of procedures, in terms of a high likelihood of dying in the hospital, and so forth. So I think sort of where does that leave us in terms of reforms, of trying to do something to sort of break this consistent increase in cost growth? The one is that we need to do something about growth in healthcare costs. And Elliot Fisher, my colleague in the medical school, and Mark McClellan at the Brookings Institution, and others have suggested creating accountable care organizations whereby rather than being paid for how many things you do, you're paid on the basis of how many patients you have, how good the quality of care it is that you're providing their patients, how satisfied they are with their care, and so forth. And that by doing so, we could actually identify very high-cost groups of physicians and hospitals treating patients that are extremely high cost. In fact, if you calculate so-called accountable care groups associated with hospitals in McAllen, Texas, it becomes very quickly obvious which are the ones that are doing lots and lots of stuff, which are the ones that are sending patients to home health care at rates 5 times the national average, and which ones are not. And so in the long term, it seems like a way of paying on the basis of performance, on the basis of high quality care at low cost, is the only way to reorganize certainly the Medicare system and probably the healthcare system as a whole. In the short term, there is another question is whether we should just start identifying, using the data we have, and start identifying high cost providers, some of those dots up at the top there, and start paying them less, having a set aside of, say, 20% of their Medicare fees, and saying, look, if you get your costs down, you can get the money back. But if you don't get your costs down, we're going to keep the money. Either way, Medicare gains. The only thing we have to make sure of is that patients don't lose. But I think that for these kinds of, certainly these kinds of medical centers, I would find it hard to believe that they would put their patients at risk. In fact, if you talk to a lot of these centers, they kind of know how they can figure out how to cut costs. There usually are ways to figure that out. So bottom line, though, is also, and this is I think a caution, is that we just don't know really how providers and patients will respond to these changes in incentives. It would be nice to have a couple years to do some pilot studies to figure out what works and what doesn't. Because at least I'm concerned that there may be these perverse responses when you start changing very complex systems. You don't know what's going to happen until, in some cases, it's too late. But can we wait for a couple of years to sort of run pilot programs and see what works and what doesn't? I'm not sure. So that, to me, is sort of what makes me nervous. What keeps me up at night is figuring out what to do about these problems. I think we have a pretty good idea. But on the other hand, we're not entirely sure that these proposals will work, or how well they'll work, or whether they'll have perverse incentives that could offset some of their benefits. Thank you.
So thank you very much. And we'd like to take some questions and answers. Some people that have questions for our panelists? Right there.
A simple question. I was a college professor for 10 years, and I paid into TIAA CREF. Have any of you ever done a study comparing TIAA CREF and Social Security?
I should disclose at the outset that I am a trustee of the CREF side of TIAA CREF. Well, I haven't done exactly that study. The key thing is that they really are very different in conception, right? TIA is a funded system where the money that is contributed is invested and used ultimately to pay the benefits that are promised on, in the case of a TIA annuity, for example, the life annuity that is promised at the back end. The Social Security system is different, as Andrew said, in that it is an unfunded system which runs fundamentally on the sort of tax revenue that can be collected to finance the ultimate benefits that are there. I think there's, and I'll turn to Andrew to say a bit more about this. In a system like a TIA CREF organization, the key determinant of the rate of return that you earn is what the market delivers to investable assets, right? And you have a menu of things. If you take a very secure product, you'll earn something that will seem like the riskless rate of return on treasury bonds. If you're prepared to take a riskier rate of return, you have a higher average rate of return, but also the risk that you go through the decline in CREF payouts that have taken place in the last year, of course. In a Social Security system, there isn't the same linkage between the rate of return in the market economy and what your benefit payout looks like.
So the question comes down to, is there scope for making an improvement if you switch to something that looked a little bit more like TIA CREF and a little bit less like what we have? So two of the key conditions that have to happen are that the economy is growing, so that by stopping the growth of Social Security, you're stopping the growth of an ever larger, in dollar terms, retirement program, and that the rate of return on assets that you would save in has to be bigger than that growth rate of the economy. If that's the case, then there's the potential to improve welfare by moving into something that looks more like a funded system. The trouble, as they say, with moving to a funded system is that one generation has got to pay twice. It's got to pay for the retirement benefits of those already collecting, and then it's got to pay to pre-fund some of its own. And so that doesn't mean that the 12% payroll tax has to double, but it does mean that you got to find some way to pay the current generation of retirees while at the same time moving resources into a new system. And so that's another 3 or 4 percentage points of payroll. And so that is the nature of the things we try to do when we propose systems that are pre-funded relative to what we currently have. So there's lots of speculation and lots of studies about what might be possible, but you almost never get around that issue that some generation has got to pay, in a sense, twice.
Why don't you scare us a little bit? Let's assume that the political will is not found to solve these thorny problems, and the debt keeps going up and up and up. And of course, these things have been talked about for decades now, and the political will hasn't been found. What eventually happens? How much debt can this country support?
I'll answer that because I'm clearly the scariest one up here. I think that you get policy action in this country when there is a very near-term payments crisis. And it's not clear what that payments crisis is going to be. It is not really going to be that Social Security can't pay out its benefits. It's not really going to be that the hospital insurance trust fund is exhausted, because that's not money that goes directly to individual beneficiaries. It's not going to be that the Medicare Part B and D are running enormous deficits. In some sense, they have a large general revenue contribution. And so I don't really know what it's going to be. As Jim pointed out, there's this thing which I like to call, it's good to be the king, which is that in moments of panic, even panic that emanates from policies that occurred in this country, we get the benefit of the flight to quality. And so the interest rates kind of move in our favor. So I don't know what the trigger will be. When the trigger happens, then drastic measures will be taken.
Yeah, let me just say, I mean, two things. First, there isn't a magic number like 98% debt to GDP that you can't go above, because some countries do manage to operate with debt to GDP ratios much higher than others, and as long as the markets believe that the chances they will ultimately get paid back are good, they'll be prepared to tolerate those debt to GDP ratios. Other cases, in developing countries where there have been debt crises, where suddenly the capital markets close down for those sovereign borrowers, they can happen at lower levels because the prospects look so bad that the capital market participants just say, look, we don't see any path to getting paid back here. I think you are already seeing, however, policy attention to these issues, right? The fact that Secretary Geithner is in China this week talking with the Chinese about what the U.S. is preparing to do as a way of trying to get onto a sustainable fiscal path. Whether that will translate into any action in Washington in terms of actual policies is very much an open question. But you're seeing the issue raised, which is for the large holders of U.S. debt abroad, and about 50% of U.S. Treasury debt is held outside this country. You're seeing the discussion already of those folks, with China being the leader here, asking the question, what are you going to do to get the fiscal house in order going forward? And that's the first step, I think, toward trying to get to some action on all this.
Gentleman over here. Yes, the gentleman over there.
Yes, you pointed to me, so.
Leave a mic, yes.
You pointed to me.
Yes.
I wonder if 2 points have been sufficiently addressed. First, economic growth. Now, if we could resume rapid economic growth in this country, then federal government would automatically have a lot more income without raising or changing tax rates. Second, the rest of the federal budget. If we could get reductions in defense, for example, then that would free up money for other reasons. So could you address those two factors?
Yeah, I mean, the first is absolutely central. The growth imperative is really, really key. And that, of course, is the argument that was made for a lot of the stimulus activity, not just in the U.S., but elsewhere in the world in the last 18 months. In that if you go off the precipice and have the economy cycle down for several years, that itself is a really big problem. As your GDP shrinks, for example, your debt to GDP ratio can go up. And given the choice between a debt to GDP ratio that's rising because you're financing expansionary fiscal policy and one that's rising because your economy is contracting sharply, the choice seemed to point toward the former rather than the latter. The second issue about what do you do elsewhere in the budget, all the dollars count the same. So if you can find other places to cut, that's important. There's a third thing you didn't ask about, and that's inflation. And that is another component, by the way, that enables you to draw down that stock of outstanding debt in real dollars that you have to pay back. One of the things that happened in the aftermath of both of the world wars was that the price level in the U.S. economy rose substantially. And since most of the debt stock is denominated in what we call nominal terms, right? You're paying back $10,000 on a bond in 2020. If the price level rises substantially, that bond in real terms declines in value. And that's another component of the policy mix that will fit into this puzzle.
Okay, we have one gentleman who's had his hand up right over here. Okay. And then you can go first, and then we'll give it to him. 2 more questions.
Yeah, I know that nobody likes to pay taxes, but my understanding is that we're at a historical low in terms of federal taxes as a percentage of GDP. Is that correct? And can you fill us in on what the long-term trend is in federal taxes as a percentage of GNP, and also what the assumption was for taxes in that 4 to 6% structural deficit that was the very first bullet?
I think you could see us conferring up here to try to make sure we had a rough guess as to what the right number was. I believe that tax to GDP at the moment is low relative to the historical average, but that in part is because we have cut taxes in the current year through the stimulus payments. It's also the case that taxes are with a given tax schedule, as the earlier comment suggested, when the economy is doing very well, we tend to collect more in revenue, right? The U.S. tax schedule is progressive, so that as as a strong economic year pushes more people into higher tax brackets, they tend to pay more taxes. And a weak economy tends to draw down, believe it or not, the tax to GDP ratio. We are not far off, however. If you look back to, say, 2006, we may be a couple of percentage points off where we have been as a historic average. We were a little bit above that average in the last couple of years of the Clinton administration. We then dipped below it for some of the part of this decade. Those couple of percentage points do matter, right? And if you're talking about a 4 to 6 percentage point of GDP hole, getting back to the historical average is very important. So that's, I think, the first part. The second part on what's built into some of the projections, the Congressional Budget Office basically takes, by law, they take whatever is on the statute books. So if they, for example, see, another thing that can get the crowd riled up is you talk about the alternative minimum tax in a setting like this. If the Congressional Budget Office is trying to forecast what the tax revenue will be going forward, many of you know that we have an alternative minimum tax, which if you played by the actual legislation for, say, 2011, about 25 million Americans would be paying the AMT. Congress has year upon year done one-year fixes to the AMT to basically say we're going to raise the thresholds and we're going to take that number from 25 million down to a few million. And the CBO, when they do their projections, they take the law as written, which says the AMT affects that large group going out after 2011. One of the things that some of the analysts outside the Congressional Budget Office do is they rekilter these numbers and say what seems like a more likely scenario as opposed to the legislated scenario at the moment. Those numbers tend to be those numbers tend to make the deficits a bit larger. As the numbers I started with from Auerbach and Gale did some of those calculations. The CBO has to take the law as written.
Yes.
Since we're talking about debtor nation in the year 2009, I think it's appropriate to ask what you think of our current administration's accumulation of debt. And where at least the fiscal conservative critics of it from the right would argue that it is accumulating debt at a very rapid rate. So the question is the kind of rationale for spending and accumulating this debt, or first of all, the question is whether it is true. You see it's this administration or its predecessor accumulating debt. And the second question is the rationale, the reasons for it, whether it's bailing out banks and large companies or the stimulus. Are those reasons, from your point of view as economists, are they worth the kind of accumulation of debt that is happening right now under President Obama?
So it was an explicitly normative question. Is it worth it? And that as
or, in terms of cost benefit.
Okay, so the highest order calling on issuing debt is something that benefits the future generation. Okay, so there's very little in what the prior administration did that was explicitly to benefit the next generation. And, it depends on your view of what the next generation would inherit if we allowed various fragile structures in the economy to implode. But ostensibly, the next generation doesn't get any direct benefit of what we're currently issuing debt to do. The next generation doesn't particularly benefit from the fact that we now have major government ownership of the automobile companies, right? You could tell a story, but that's basically issuing debt to clean up a mess that we made. So the question for me always comes down to, you can run deficits as part of the business cycle, but only if you have a plan to pay them back in the upside of the business cycle. I'll know that we have a more serious administration when they release an economic forecast that has the economy growing at its potential and the budget is in balance or in surplus. Until you see that, you should never really put the label of fiscally responsible in some absolute sense onto any administration. And the problem is not really with the politicians, the problem is with us, because we tend to, as a polity, we tend to vote in a narrow interest, my taxes, my benefits, and the like. There hasn't been a time in my voting lifetime where the more fiscally responsible candidate wasn't punished for having raised the taxes or cut the expenditures. And so until we have higher standards and we internalize some of these challenges, I don't really think it's reasonable to expect that magically some statesman, not politician, statesman will appear and solve these problems by doing that.
Okay, one last question. All right, all the way back.
In these accountable core organizations that you described as a possible solution, one possible solution, what specifically would you measure to measure quality and cost? And how can you be sure that providers, in rushing to optimize those metrics, don't hurt healthcare significantly?
Those are great questions, and I would have liked to go into more detail, and there's a lot of background material on these accountable care organizations. The most common question I hear about these is, well, what's different between managed care in the 1990s and accountable care organizations, where groups of physicians and the hospital where they tend to admit their patients are rewarded as a group for how well they do in terms of cutting cost growth. So the idea of an accountable care organization, just as sort of background, is that we can actually now identify, roughly speaking, 4,000 sort of natural groups of physicians and hospitals based on where they actually admit their patients, and start rewarding those groups based on whether they are able to restrain growth in the future, and perhaps have things like shared savings, where if they keep their growth rates down below, say, 2%, they get some of those savings in conjunction with savings to Medicare. And so the idea, in some cases, there are sort of shovel-ready ACOs. For example, a place like the Mayo Clinic would be a natural, or DHMC would be a natural ACO because they've already organized themselves. But this would provide an incentive to get a lot of the single physicians and solo practitioners or partners to sort of start working with one another to try to sort of figure out, well, gee, maybe if we don't admit all of our difficult patients to the emergency room, we could somehow figure out how to save money. The question is, how do you balance the desire to make sure that people get the best possible care with the desire to reduce costs? And that is always going to be a tension that's going to occur in any kind of health reform. And the difference between managed care of the 1990s, which is generally considered to be a complete disaster, and this current ACO is, in the case of the current ACO, it's the physicians who are getting together and talking to one another. It's not an insurance program that's imposed from above by some third-party big insurance company forcing doctors and patients to do things in a certain way. It's physicians sitting down and saying, you know, we could really figure out the handoff for patients who are discharged from the hospital with a hip replacement, for example, and make sure that we don't rack up a lot of costs where they're bouncing around from home health care agencies, maybe into nursing homes and so forth and so on. We can figure out how to sort of make make the system of healthcare work better. And in terms of measuring quality, this is a difficult one, and I think we're sort of still learning about how to really get good measures of quality. But there are a large number of measures that are already in use. Things like, you know, are people getting flu shots? But we would propose to extend that to actual questions, which you add follow-up questions for patients after they've had procedures done, and questions such as, do you experience pain that your doctor doesn't know about? Or have you been given drugs or a test which your doctor hasn't explained? Or is there something that you feel as if you should have gotten that you didn't get? And so those are the kinds of ways I think that we're hoping that sort of in the future that you can much more accurately measure quality of care, not just on simple process measures, but also are the patients happy with, are the clients really happy with the kind of care they've been receiving?
Well, thank you very much. I hope that this was very informative, and thank you very much to our three panelists.
Say